Hello everybody. In this video I'm gonna talk about distribution of species and what affects the distribution of a certain species. So why are some species found only in certain areas and not in others? That's what we will talk about in this video. And to explain this, I'll introduce some concepts. So I'm going to introduce the concept of zone of stress and zone of intolerance. And we will also talk about limiting factors. But to sum up or to draw on some of the stuff that we have covered already, I just want to remind you about the community concept. So all the populations of different species living together in a certain area, and these species would of course affect each other, right? And if we also take the abiotic factors into consideration, then we talk about the whole ecosystem. But different populations of different species will affect each other's. And like I just said, abiotic factors will also influence populations of different species, and this is a list of all the lots of different abiotic factors: pH, light, water availability, temperature, all these different things. And the biotic factors, which are competition between species, the fact that some of them eat each other, some of them might also benefit from living close together. You'll see more examples of this in a video a little later. Yeah, so both the abiotic environment and the other species living in the same area will affect populations. And one example of a distribution of a specific species is this picture showing the global distribution of reef-building corals. And this is an example of an animal. In the guide it says that you should know both an animal example and a plant example. So this will be your animal example because the coral is actually an animal. But you can see these red dots indicating where the reef-building corals are found. And we can see that they're only found in more tropical areas, right? So they have a certain distribution. They're not just all over the place. And if we then zoom in and take a closer look at those organisms, reef-building corals, then it's actually what is defined as a mutualistic symbiosis between two species. So the coral polyp is an animal, and inside the tissue of this animal, we have one-celled algae living. And this specific type of algae is called Zooxanthella. So embedded in the tissue of the coral animal, we have one-celled algae. And those algae, they do photosynthesis, so they use sunlight and they use carbon dioxide and water to produce sugars and other organic molecules, and they also release oxygen, right? And this is pretty nice because then the coral can use the sugar and the other organic molecules produced by the algae, and it can of course also use the oxygen produced by the algae. And when the cells in the coral then break down the organic molecules in respiration, they release carbon dioxide, then the algae can then use again for photosynthesis. The algae also gets protection out of this. So instead of living in the surrounding water, it's embedded in the coral and protected from the outside. And the thing is that what defines the distribution, at least part of what defines the distribution of the reef-building corals, is the temperature, because the algae cannot survive in temperatures lower than 18 degrees Celsius. And if the ocean temperatures increase above approximately 35 degrees Celsius, then the algae would leave the coral. And this is actually what is referred to as coral bleaching, because if the algae leaves the coral, then it will no longer have the bright colors that it had because the algae was inside it. So it will look bleached. And this will of course be unhealthy for the coral. It can actually not survive without its algae. So the coral will then die if the algae leaves the coral. So temperature is limiting the distribution of the reef building corals. If we then take a look at a plant example, then we can take a look at oak trees. So this is a map showing the distribution of oak trees. This is a native ranch, the green areas, and then they have been introduced to some other sites, and they also have isolated populations where there are these little crosses. But just looking at the map, we can already see that there is something limiting the distribution of this oak tree. And again, it's primarily temperature. So oak trees are found in most of Europe except up here where it's too cold and down here where it's too warm. And that's because oak trees are deciduous trees, so they shed their leaves when it's either too cold or too dry. So down here it would be too warm and too dry, too much water would evaporate from the leaves. So they would eventually shed their leaves to avoid too much water evaporating from the plant. And up here they would shed their leaves because it's too cold to sustain the leaves and too cold for them to do photosynthesis. So they are pretty sensitive to temperatures as well, these deciduous forests, and they will only be found in certain areas where the climate is sufficient or good for them. And to explain this, to explain the distribution of species, we can use these two concepts, zone of stress and zone of intolerance. So if we look at a graph, we can see we have some kind of environmental factor. It could be temperature, for instance. So each species would have an optimal zone, an optimal temperature, if it was temperature that we were looking at, that would be somewhere in the middle of the graph. If the temperature becomes too high, then we refer to that as the zone of stress. And if it becomes much too high, so that the species can not live there at all, we would refer to that as the zone of intolerance. On the other side of the spectrum, if the temperature becomes too low, we call that zone of stress. And if it becomes way too low so that the species can no longer survive, then we refer to that as the zone of intolerance. And on the y-axis of this graph, we have number of individuals. So this means that within this span of this environmental factor, we would have the highest number of individuals. In the zone of stress, so if the temperature becomes this low, we could still sustain perhaps a small population, but we wouldn't see many individuals. And if we end up here in the zone of intolerance, there would be no individuals of this species. The same goes for up here. Few individuals in the zone of stress and no individuals found in the zone of intolerance. This is another example, sort of just showing the same thing. So a lot of individuals in the optimum range of pH or temperature or salinity or humidity or whatever it is. Few individuals in the zone of stress and no individuals in the zone of intolerance. So this is zones of stress and zones of intolerance, and we can use that to explain distribution of species. Then there's also the concept of limiting factors. And the most limiting factor is defined as the factor that determines the yield or that determines the size of the population. And it's often shown using this representation. So this is a barrel, and you can see the different pieces of tree that makes up the barrel. And if some of them, the lowest one will be the one that sort of defines how high the water can go inside the barrel. So if there is not enough potassium for a plant to grow, for instance, then it doesn't really matter that there's a lot of phosphorus or a lot of there's sufficient heat and a lot of light and a lot of other things, because if it runs out of potassium, then it can't grow, then it can't sustain a larger population. So there is always one factor that will be the most limiting factor and would determine the size of the population. So pause the video and take a moment to think, to see which factors might limit the population size of these 3 species. So pause the video and think. And I have some suggestions for you. So factors limiting the population of squirrels could be the temperature. It could, of course, be food items such as seeds and other things that this might want to feed on. It could also be shelter. So enough trees for them to build their little nesting sites or whatever it is that they where they live. Same goes for the fox over here. Temperature could be a limiting factor, so could the number of prey. And again, places to build their burrows or whatever else they need to sustain themselves. And for this plant, for this oak tree down here, of course, temperature again, but also light intensity and also water availability. These 2 guys up here would, of course, also need to have enough water to sustain themselves, right? So there's a lot of factors that could potentially limit the population, and it would depend under certain circumstances which factor would be the most limiting. So that was it for now, and I'll be back soon with another video. Bye for now.